we have been journeying as fellows to ask questions about theology from the perspective of making. So culture care begins for us as makers, and to see this journey from creation to new creation. And Enneagram is essential for me to understand myself, my shadows, and to be able to journey as a creative person. I'm a 4 with a 3 wing. That means, I can get trapped in my feelings. I need to snap out of it by being busy and organizing things like this. So
it's a tortured combination.
It's a tortured combination.
It actually is. Can I tell you why?
Yes.
So the 4 has a fixation on authenticity. It's very important that you be authentic in your expression and your person. But the 3,
it's the other way.
When it's not very self-aware, is not authentic. It's constantly parading masks and personas to win the admiration of the crowd. And so you'll get done with something like this, or a speaking event, and if you were not very self-aware, your 4 would begin to prosecute the 3. Mm-hmm. And say to it,
all the time.
Yeah,
yes.
and would say, you are so full of it. You pulled the wool over their eyes. If they only knew. And the 3 looks back at the 4 and says, do you want to make a living? Right? I was in an AA meeting about 2 weeks ago. Yeah. And I'll tell you, if you ever want to hear like the most amazing wisdom come out of people's mouths without their knowing it, just go to an AA or Al-Anon meeting. Because people are speaking out of what is called their experience, strength, and hope, is what we say. And this guy sort of looked off in the distance and he said, one day I realized that I had to embrace my contradictions and make a life out of them. Yeah. And I went, oh my gosh, that's genius, and I think that's what I mean when I say, that 4 with a 3 is a contradiction. And so we have to work with our contradictions and embrace them all.
Is that true with a lot of the numbers with wings? Is it an inherent contradiction?
No, not necessarily. One of the nice things about wings is it tells you what your secondary fear is. Mm-hmm. So if your basic fear of in being a 1, let's say, is around not being good, right? Or making mistakes, that sort of a thing. And you have a 2 wing, then the 2's fear of, let's say, among many, abandonment in the face of not being able to meet the needs of other people. That would tell that 1, I actually have this other shadow fear back here, this sort of secondary fear. It's a little bit more like secondhand smoke than it is solid, but it's there.
Yeah, okay.
It's there.
Okay, I'll open this up. Yeah, anybody have thoughts or things you want to ask Ian?
What number do you think it makes me if I just want to talk about my number?
So there are some behaviors that the Enneagram can't actually account for. I don't know. Because ultimately, what determines type isn't a particular behavior, but the unconscious motivation driving the behavior. One of the things that we often say in the Enneagram world is, it's not what you do that matters, it's why you do it. Mm-hmm. And this is, by the way, what makes the Enneagram distinct, and it distinguishes it from other typologies, which are all valuable. I'm all in favor of, go take a Myers-Briggs, or go, take a Colby or a Hogan or whatever system that you want to use. The better, more self-knowledge you have, the better, right? So we don't have a proprietary right on the truth here, in the Enneagram world. It deals with underlying motivation, unconscious motivation. Most or many psychological instruments are more about their trait specific. But the only one that I would say is particularly good as a psychometric is the Big 5 personality test. It's just very well validated, but I just don't find it as interesting, especially on a spiritual level. What also distinguishes the Enneagram is it reveals not only what's your strength and your superpower, your divine given charisma, it reveals to you the shadow. And as Jung said, no one grows until you pass through the furnace of your passion and your shadow. And that's true. It's true in the hero's journey, for example, and it's just always true. Got to go to the shadow.
How would you suggest one beginning that shadow work? I mean, maybe it's different for all types, but just on a blanket statement.
Are you all familiar with the work of Joseph Campbell? Most of you, I'm sure, right? Hero of a Thousand Faces. Another person we read on this would be The Seven Basic Plots, Christopher Booker, I think, on the sort of the arc of the narrative that we see repeatedly across cultures, which is the hero's journey. Can I give you a great example of one? Yeah. So recently someone asked me who my spiritual hero was, and I just told them, it's Pinocchio. Pinocchio starts life as a puppet. He's not a real boy. And please, I'm being gender specific here. We can, as I say it, please be sure to insert your gender in here. But so here we have this creature is animated. It's not alive. It's animated, right? Not fully alive yet, and it's not real. In the Disney adaptation, right, the blue fairy shows up, has sort of the representative of the divine. We have the divine feminine right there, right? And she says, oh, no, you're not a real boy, not until you prove yourself to be brave, unselfish, and true. So right away, I can just tell you that from a Christian perspective, we have now just entered the space of a very, we've sort of lost touch with it because we know that that's a conditionality. There's no grace there, right? It's a works sort of oriented mindset. Doesn't negate the power of the journey. Not real. Then he sets out on a journey of misadventures. Remember Stromboli, the circus, and then we also had the Pleasure Island. And remember, he becomes a vandal. He's a liar. He smokes cigars, right? He plays pool. He throws a brick through the window of a church. My gosh, this is fantastic. These are misadventures, right? And what you see there is a utterly egocentric life. He's not real yet. But what's interesting is on the misadventures, he actually becomes less human than the person he set out to become. He becomes a donkey. Yeah. So then he goes home. It's like he realizes the error of his ways, and he goes home. But there's something wrong. Geppetto's not there. His dad, right, the woodcarver Geppetto, he's not there. So it's very sad. Now, he could have opted to stay, which is what many, many people do. They don't keep going on the journey. I call that living in a gated community with a golf membership, settling for that life and avoiding the shadow and dying vanilla at best. But Pinocchio makes this great decision. He's going to go find Geppetto because life at home will feel empty and incomplete without Geppetto. So where does he have to go? Monstro the whale. He has to, remember the beautiful scene in the film, right? He diving into the depths and he says, where's Monstro? He's asking all these fish and eels and whatnot. And they're all like, oh, we don't want to talk about Monstro. And they run away, right? This is the shadow. This is Darth Vader. This is the Wicked Witch of the West. These are all archetypes of what's in your shadow. You must face what Dorothy and Luke and all these different people have to realize is that Darth Vader is part of you. That's what he's facing. Mm-hmm. Pinocchio has to realize that the monstro is part of who he is. He has to go into that shadow and do that work. And only then can he leave. And by the way, what happens to him immediately following? He dies. He dies saving Geppetto. He comes up on the shore and he's dead. Mm-hmm. And that's when the blue fairy comes and says, oh, Pinocchio, you have proven yourself to be brave, unselfish, and true, and therefore you've now become a real boy. So this journey from unreal to real, and I actually believe, in a way, that is the summit of the Christian journey, is to become real. Lewis actually has a lot to say about that you're born bios, which meaning just biological, physical reality, like a puppet, and the goal is to become nous, N-O-U-S, which is animated with spirit. Long way to answer your question. If you want to stay in the gated community, You can stop there. You have that agency. But if you want to grow and become real, you must pass through your own shadow and die. And then be born again, risen. And that's true across faith traditions, literature, everything. That is the journey. So it is a decision, and life might force it on you. But I hope, in a way.
We were talking about trauma and how one's trauma can define you in some way, and you were talking about the power of storytelling. I always like to say that, the word authority has the word author in it. It's a creative word.
Yeah.
We tend to wrestle against authority,
Right.
but it's really about who owns your story, right? So, and you were saying something about how to move from traumatized state to a more full state.
The genius James Hillman once said, it's not the trauma you experience in life that's traumatic, it's the interpretation of the trauma that's causing so much suffering. We tend to believe that the story we tell others and ourselves about who we are, how we became to be the person we are, and the person who we are becoming, we make the assumption it's true, as though we know. And so one of the most important questions I think you can ask in life is, how do I know if the story I've been telling myself about who I am and the person I'm becoming is true? What if it's just a children's story? Because that's when it was written. It was written through the eyes of a child who experienced these events and made an interpretation of what they meant. And I said earlier this morning, all children are incredibly narcissistic. The whole universe revolves around them, right? So what the formula in a child's mind might be something like, I am as I am treated. My identity is as I am treated, So they build a worldview around it, and a personality organizes itself around that wound. And what they don't realize, I think, at some point in life is, what if that story was just a first draft? What if you actually have the agency and the power to, and you have the obligation, I think, personally, to, with adult eyes, to go back and review the story and change the way that you see it. And there are ways to do it. It's very hard to disentangle yourself from that story because it's so deeply programmed and embedded in the psyche. But you can, and there are proven methods for it. Let me give you an example of this. On a retreat, sometimes this is what I'll do. I'll tell people, please write down your story, 350, 500 words. And then I'm going to pair you off with somebody. And I want you to tell your story to each other, read your story to one another. And then I don't tell them this when they arrive. And then I say, just bring the story. Then I say, okay, so now what I'd like you to do is tell the same story from the perspective of you as of the villain of the story, of your life story. And then I say, now I'll tell it from the perspective of you as the victim of your life story. And then I ask them the third time to read their story from the perspective of them as the hero. And I tell them, you get to choose now. You can't change history. You can't change the facts. For example, I will always have had an abusive alcoholic father. Always. I can't revise history. That's psychotic. But I can change how I view what that history means, what it meant, because my child didn't know it. It just assumed that it was to blame, it was at fault for what it experienced. But the child will always feel like they deserved it.
They deserve to be...
As they are treated.
Okay.
Psychologically, for the child to realize that the parent is responsible for it, well, that parent is in charge of their survival. Mm-hmm. It'd be much easier psychologically for them to blame it on themselves and maintain the belief that that person's totally right and they must be totally wrong. So that's a very important dynamic. in my own experience, I think, I felt growing up as if somehow or another I had been forsaken. And of course, this was the development of a 4-style personality or worldview. If you think of the Enneagram types as narratives, not personality types, because really they're stories. And the underlying theme of each of those stories is a basic premise or plot, right? It's not okay for me to make mistakes, 1s. In order to be loved, I must be needed, that's 2s, right? 3s, in order to, I see a world in which I am what I do, and therefore I have to achieve. What do you notice about all 9 stories? They are in direct opposition to the story of grace. So whatever story you're in as your type, I can just tell you now, it's the wrong story. Now that doesn't mean I'm going to delete your personality. I just want to free you of the confines of the story that created it. Just because your number doesn't mean you know you.
Yeah.
You just know the person that you concocted as a child to survive. Carl Jung says it so beautifully, and I'm going to barbarize the quote right now. He says, "What helped you survive in the morning of life will not serve you in the afternoon of life." So let it go. Hard journey, but you can do it. And it involves passing through the shadow.
Marco in Culture Care talks a lot about interdependence. Can you say something about how Enneagrams helps us to understand both the needs and the opportunities for us to find our proper place in building interdependent communities?
Can you just articulate interdependence for a second?
Yeah, I'm wrapped up because I always talk about dependent relationships or communities and independent relationship or communities, and how basically in this country you have 2 strands of polar opposite, let's say politically, ideologically, one toward independence, the other toward dependence, but you don't have the interdependent model. So as an artist, I see interdependence all the time because color wheel is interdependent. The purple against yellow is an opposite spectrum, so they will fight against each other. So with orange and green, because if you mix orange and green, it becomes this ugly brown. Same thing with purple and yellow. So you avoid this, right, as if you're a painter learning to paint.
Right.
Culture care, we have to move away from dependence model and independence model and create interdependence, which means that we can actually affirm the differences, even what would typically make us enemies. But under a master painter like Matisse uses these complementary colors all the time, opposite colors all the time. But because he is a master painter, they work. This is what democracy needs to look like. We have polar opposites, but we need people, we need leaders who can think like an artist. So going back to Enneagram is kind of like that. You have polar opposites, right? You have vying. So it is like a color wheel, 9 personality kind of stories. So I think what Joe's asking is, how would you paint with that?
Yeah, my brain is monkey mind with answers right now. So just an interesting idea. And then would someone remind me at the end of this little thing I'm about to say, ask me what number Jesus is? Because that's part of the answer. All right, so what draws people to different political ideologies, right, is not opinion so much as it is temperament. So it's personality driven.
Right. That's right.
So there's that big 5 personality measure I was mentioning earlier. It measures on 5 scales, right? One is called openness to experience. The other one is conscientiousness. The other one is extroversion. The other one is agreeableness. And the last is neuroticism. Okay? So they're on scales. And people who are very high in openness to experience, which is probably almost everybody in this room. And it's also it's the hardest scale to define. But what it is this ability to see the big thing, the blue sky. It's people with high openness to experience are able to hold opposites in tension. They're open to new ideas all the time. People who are high in openness to experience are invariably liberal. They score higher on empathy. And so they're, by virtue of their dispositional traits and personalities, like they're just sort of like gravitate in that direction. Now, people who score very high in conscientiousness tend to be drawn more to a conservative political and social worldview. They don't like change. They don't like new ideas. They don't, do you know what I'm saying? They like order. They like predictability. People high in openness to experience, you know, it's like, let's throw the old thing out, try a new thing. You know, it's like, if you have a company or a group that's just full of people who have openness to experience, you're in a lot of trouble, right? Because here's the thing.
Yeah.
People who are high in openness to experience are great at starting companies, but you better have some highly conscientious people running HR and accounting and whatnot. And you better have some 6s doing risk management. And you better have a 1 doing your contracts. Yeah. You better have your 2 doing customer relations. Yeah. You better have your 5 doing research, or your data data analytics. You may have your 7 who's out there dreaming and innovating constantly. And your 9 also may make great HR people, because they just are so good at seeing the world through all these eyes and doing conflict. So where I'm going is that we need each other. This is also just out of the Newer Testament, right? It's just like, how can the hand say to the foot, I don't need you? It's like, no. Good luck, right? Mm-hmm. Like I'm doing a corporate gig on, which is where I do most of my work now. And I just had them plot the results of an inventory I had them do on the Enneagram on a wheel. I want them to see who's missing. Yeah. So this is a company of 2,000 people, and on their top leadership team, there are no 6s. Mm-hmm. And I'm like, I'm just going to ask the question on that day, who's tapping the brakes around here? You got a lot of 3s, 7s, and 8s in here that are like charging forward, but who's the one who says, don't you think we ought to wait until there's more cash flow? You better have that person around, right? In a larger transcendent sense, the same applies. Now, the reason I brought up what number is Jesus as part of an answer to this question, is that it's number one. I get the 2 most frequent questions I get are, what number is Donald Trump? And what number is Jesus? I always get these questions, So let me just at least answer one. That's safer, which is, what number is Jesus? Okay, so I don't have a picture of the Enneagram here, but you know what it looks like, right? We got this circle, let's say, we'll use the circle version, and it has that crazy 9-pointed geometric figure inside. And in the middle of it, there's a giant white field, right? You know what I'm talking about? And I always tell people, Jesus lives in the middle of the white field. He has no type. What that means is he doesn't have this arthritic grip on one particular way of being in the world. Yeah. Where he lives is in this space in which all of these dimensions of God's nature are utterly available to him. He can throw over tables like an 8. He can turn to a woman touching the hem of his garment like a 4 would, and feel her pain, and turn it both into beauty and empathy. We're the most empathic number on the Enneagram, 4s. So all this is available in the moment. So we talk about spiritual formation. Where are we going, right? So I always tell people in spiritual formation, the trick is not to become just healthy in your type. I actually don't like that version of the Enneagram. Just become a healthier version of not you. What I would say is that the journey is toward the middle. Interesting. Where you've let go of your grip on this sort of faux strategy for getting through life with your needs met. It's just to let go and get to the middle. But very few people make it to the middle. Precious few. Yeah. So in terms of interdependence, I think if we all can get into the middle field, we'd all be in. But that's Edenic, isn't it? That's Eden in the field.
Oh, powerful.
It's amazing what lunch and a cup of coffee will do, isn't it?
Could you elaborate a little bit more on what's involved in passing through the shadow?
Yeah, it's a great question. So the shadow is where we relegate all those parts of us that we've learned to despise and to be ashamed of, to hate, because as kids we heard that they weren't acceptable and that we would not experience belongingness and getting our needs met for like just maybe three dimensions. One would be our need for esteem and approval. Listen to me, 2s, 3s, and 4s. For safety and security. Listen to me, 5s, 6s, and 7s. And for a sense of power and control. Hear me, 8, 9s, and 1s. These are just basic needs of children, right? But what if you hear, yeah, but if you keep doing X or behaving that way, right? Like messages like, well, little girls don't do that. Or, polite, we pick up these messages like, oh, I gotta stop doing that, right? Or like a message I heard growing up was from my father and from my mother, truthfully, was stop pestering me. And so I'll tell you, even now at 57, I always think of myself as a pest. I'm always apologizing sometimes. Do you know what I mean? It's almost like, I don't mean to bug you. It's like that movie, sorry to bother you, It's like, you know what I mean? It's like, right? And so I've had to learn to be very conscious of it, that no, that's an old story. That's the wrong story. Wrong story again. I'm in the wrong story, right? So the shadow contains parts of ourselves too that are legitimately dark and should stay in there, right? The parts of us that can participate in a genocide. Those animal instincts that are murderous and terrible. And as I mentioned earlier, it also contains those great gifts of ours that our culture may have said weren't acceptable for a woman to have or a man to have. You know what I mean? It's like, oh, we got to put that in the shadow too. So part of integration, which I think is what I think sanctification is, right? Is going into the shadow and, number one, facing our sin. Those things we have done because we didn't feel at home here. And out of that frustration and pain, we've done things that, right? And you can do that, for example, in our tradition by doing a whole sacrament of reconciliation, where you take it's a long process. You really do your inventory. It's like an AA. You have to do it. It's a matter of survival. That's the beauty of AA. 12 steps are for everybody. By the way, if you want to read a wonderful book, Russell Brand's new book, Recovery, is phenomenal. And it's actually for everybody. It's not just for addicts and alcoholics. I mean, literally, it's for everybody. And part of that journey, of course, is made a list of all those we had harmed. It's also taking your inventory is like, okay, what's my stuff? What did I do? Who am I? Like, where's the dark side? But in the context of a church community, then to go to your priest or whoever, or if you're not from that kind of a tradition, to find some way to do this with a monastery spiritual director, a priest, or a monk or something. And you do the sacrament of reconciliation, which is essentially an inventory. It's going into the shadow and looking at who am I really? To look at our brokenness, not because we want to wallow in shame. Like, in fact, I'll just tell you that shame is utterly, if love is the most powerful force for change in the universe, shame is like, in terms of power, a close second to love. In terms of its toxicity, its power, And we can't get free of it, actually, until we get a light in the shadow. Because the only thing shame's afraid of is exposure. It's the only thing it doesn't want. I don't want nobody to know. That's the source of shame. It grows like mildew in the dark. It doesn't grow in the light. So part of the journey is, if you don't crash, a crash will usually be the thing that makes you go into the shadow. You know what I mean? Like some crash of some kind, some great, terrible failure, or great love, maybe even too. So you have to go in the shadow and face the truth of who you are in all of your, and when I say, by the way, this morning, also your beauty, most of us don't want to see that either. Because then who's going to be responsible for it? Who's going to have to use it for the betterment of the world? Now, great, now I'm beautiful. I'm obligated to do something with that. That's going to take calories, you know what I mean? So the shadow's complicated, but you have to pass through it in order to integrate so that the old egoic self can die and rise again to be a new creation. And you'll do it repeatedly. It ain't a one and done deal. It's a cycle, it seems to me, because you don't get everything on the first pass, You keep having to to go through it en route to the other side. So the theologian René Girard. Everyone studied René Girard here?
Yeah.
Okay, so we know about
Scapegoat.
that. All right, so the scapegoat. See, this is why culturally, talking to culture care, and Jung would talk about this, do we have a collective unconscious? So we don't stand in isolation from each other with the shadow. We have a collective shadow. What do you think lives in America's shadow? Come on, what is it? It's obvious, right? Racism. Slavery. It's in the shadow. Nobody wants to talk about it. You know what I'm saying? It's like white fragility. It's like, I don't want to go to the shadow. It's like, just go through the damn shadow. We get this done. You know what I mean? Like, we got to go in there and own it, and then we can die and come back to life together. Yeah. You see? And the problem with the collective shadow is when the group doesn't want to face its shadow, it will pick a person or another group on which to project it. Yes. Do you see that? So it's either people who are, who's up this week? Oh, it's pro-abortion people, or it's gay people, or it's black people, or it's Hispanic people, or it's people who want to come over the wall, or it's going to be this. This is projected shadow material. And if we faced it and kind of like did our work, but this is the cultural danger of people not doing their shadow work, is that we will, because we are by nature connected to one another, we will coalesce around this stuff, and then movements can start, ideas can start that take hold and make us collectively sick or go to war or kill each other. Kill each other if the shadow doesn't get resolved. So on that happy note, so there are practices, spiritual practices that you could employ that would help you to develop the attentional muscle in the brain and to strengthen what we might call the inner observer, to be able to pull back in the moment and observe the way that you're acting, thinking, and feeling and the effect it's having on another human being in the moment and regulate it better.
Self-control.
Self-control and just being more attuned and making different choices than that you before, when you didn't know who you were enough and you were just always living in reactivity, not in a responsive way to people. So I think the gift of the Enneagram actually is just basic self-knowledge. And self-awareness is something that is when you put self-knowledge to work. So let me just give you an example of one practice. All of you can do, and it's rooted in our tradition, and I'll give you 2 books you can read on it. I just believe that everybody needs to have a daily practice of meditation. Now, I can call it mindfulness if you want, and just speak to it from a clinical perspective. Read the research from the University of Massachusetts Amherst or at Stanford. A regular practice of mindfulness increases dramatically empathy, compassion, and what it does is it brings you into the present moment more. It actually heightens, by the way, for artists, this is terribly important. I'll tell you why. Because it's a proven fact that what it does is it heightens perceptive appreciation.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's like defragging. Remember that old term, like your hard drive, you know? It's like decluttering. It's like, so your level of perceptive appreciation of the world around you becomes dramatically different. Does anyone have a practice? A sitting practice? Okay. I'm just going to be completely honest with you. I don't know to the degree to which Fuller is okay with this. But I do believe that wherever truth is found, you should avail yourselves of it. Isn't that Martin Luther or Calvin? I can't remember. It was one of those two. The Buddhists write about it better than anybody. If you want to read about compassion, read the Buddhists. Not because they do a better job than the Christians, they just do a better job, I think, of articulating it. Right? That it's more, the colors are more beautiful to me. So I just go, I'm a bit of a scavenger, you know. I'm always out just sort of like, wow, ooh, you know, and saying, I'm not trying to import or to create a Frankenstein monster out of my spirituality by taking pieces from here and here and like making a monster. It's just like, oh, no, but I'm just gonna go pillage Babylon. That looks awesome. And that can be brought in here and it's not discontinuous with the gospel, so I'm using it. Do you know what I'm saying? Like, I am using that and bringing that back to my people because that's really smart stuff, right? So the mindfulness practice or a regular prayer meditation, Protestants lost at the Reformation a lot of this material. But read Martin Laird's book, L-A-I-R-D, Catholic priest, Villanova University, a beautiful book called Into the Silent Land. It's a magnificent book on meditation as a classic Christian discipline. He does the historical and then also into the practicals of it. Rowan Williams was the one who helped kind of bring me in. Rowan has a daily 30 or 60-minute practice of, he does walking meditation. And he swears by it. And that's how I, almost 20 years ago, began a sitting meditation. And when I don't do it, the difference is amazing how bad it gets. Because I start to live asleep. I start falling back into the trance of the same old, instead of being present to my life and able to say, okay, what's going on right now? What's happening to me right now in this conversation? What am I feeling? When I start to have afflictive emotions, shame, disappointment, guilt, whatever, I ask 3 questions. What am I believing right now? Is it true? What would my life look like if I just stopped believing this was true? Because most of us are just reacting to movies, like we're making movies in our head all day long. Of what's going on with our relationships, and and we think they're true. Like one big thing the Buddhists will teach is, you don't have to believe your thoughts. They're just thoughts. None of us stop to think that. It's like, well, if I think it must be true. It's like, no. It's just a thought. It's going through like a weather pattern. Let it go. That one's not good. And meditation will help you see those for what they are. But if you're asleep, they can take control. They have complete autonomy to make you do whatever they want. But maybe in the art, we can ask some of these questions, like, what are you believing right now? Is it true? What would your life be like if you didn't believe that was true?
Talk about where you were when you wrote that. The book is not about you.
No.
But you were just coming out of a...
All memoir is fiction, and all fiction is autobiography. Trust me.
You were coming out of you planted a church successfully. It's still going. You had enormous success.
Okay.
And you write this book about a burnt-out pastor going to chase after St. Francis in Assisi. What was that about? Like, why would you write about that? Like, expose your story.
You actually raised a really good question, which was, I wrote that 5 years before I left that church.
Yeah.
I did not know that I was actually writing my story.
That is so true. That is so true.
So let's talk about shadow.
Yeah.
And talk about hidden presences, or what one poet calls history's unmade beds.
Yeah.
Do you see what I'm saying?
Wow.
So I didn't know that I knew in my heart where this was going, that I needed to leave, and I didn't. And I was having such theological dissonance there, and you know what I mean? And this thing I had created, I needed to move on, but I didn't know how to get extricated myself. I won't bore you with the details.
Intuition was ahead of you processing this without knowing.
Totally.
So this thing happens all the time. What's happening here?
It does. We are so hauntingly beautiful and deep beyond our wildest imaginations. And I can't underscore enough for you. I know this is a terrible thing but maybe as artists you know this more than most, and that is that we are controlled by things of which we are, on a moment-to-moment basis, utterly unaware. And sometimes I think we make the unfortunate choice to call those demons or something. I'm not sure we should assign it some kind of separate, personally intelligent, evil force that's at work. It's like, no, it's just part of your sin nature. There's just stuff under there at work, and we just be aware and live humbly enough to know it's there, right? But art is beautiful at bringing and the shadow. I mean, and the reason it is, and I said this in Chasing Francis, which is why I started there, is that art is subversive. And if you want to convey a great truth to somebody, right, don't go in the front door. Because if you write a book on grace, let's say, and you go in the front door of the rational mind to somebody, they'll read it and begin immediately to have objections. Like their critical filters are up and running. So I was, when the front door is closed, go in the back door of the imagination. So instead of reading a book about grace, make a film like Babette's Feast. Right. Well, and that's an obvious one. There's obviously others that equally, if not more, powerful. But I think in the creative life, any work that you produce will always have unintended consequences, ones you did not see. So, like when I wrote Chasing Francis, the purpose of the book was to introduce people, particularly Protestant evangelicals back in the day when the emergent church movement was happening. And they all were kept describing this Christian they wanted to be. And I'm like, as a former Catholic kid growing up, I was like, this person already existed, right? Like, he's in your garden with a bird bath, It's like, that guy's already done what you're describing, right? I mean, he's the icon. I mean, many tongue-in-cheek, in a tongue-in-cheek, half tongue-in-cheek way, historians will say that, Francis, they call him the last Christian. So you have unintended consequences. Like, I wrote the book for that purpose, was to introduce them to St. Francis. And what did they all fixate on? The pastor. Francis, they're like, okay, yeah, that's great. I want to know what happens to that pastor because I'm living that life.
Yeah.
And it was an unintended consequence. I was like, I didn't write the book for that purpose. And yet your attention is migrated to this pastor. What's interesting is, we just discussed, it's like, well, that happened to be me, which is interesting.
Yeah. And you were walking in that path
without
of
knowing.
Discovery. Without
I was
knowing.
writing it and not knowing, oh, by the way, you're writing about yourself, right?
Yeah.
And so the unintended consequence of your work is, I think, is what you leave up to God.
Right.
When you're done, you just leave it up to God. I mean, that's Flannery O'Connor's thing. When you finish a book, put it out in the world, then it's none of your business what happens.
Yeah.
It's all up to God. Are there any writers in here, like fiction writers or?
That is just poet.
Yeah. So, and you? All right. So, but this is interesting for everybody because I think it applies to different art forms. Here's the big lesson I learned writing my first work of fiction was that I learned more about God and about theology from this, actually. As I was writing, I don't write with an outline. So I just begin with an idea, and then I just start writing the story. And I don't know where it's going. I don't even know how it's going to end. I did not know how Chasing Francis was going to end until 5 pages before the ending. I remember that day. It's like, well, I think we're done. Where are we going? And it's like, now, here's what's interesting. As I was writing it, characters would emerge. And I remember one time being in San Diego at something, and I'm writing the book, I'm about 3 chapters in, and I hear this voice. Too many guys. Nope, it's too masculine a voice. And I'm thinking, oh, I got to put a love interest in here? I remember, I don't know who I was talking to, but I think I'm talking to the book.
Yeah.
Literally, I'm talking to the book.
Yeah.
And I'm like saying, no, really? But if I do, what am I going to do with her? Is she going to stick for the whole thing? It's going to complicate matters. Now I got, you know what I mean? Like I'm talking to, it's like, book's like, well, you don't have to do it, but your reader will know you're a stink bomb if you don't. They'll know that you weren't being true, that you were probably writing Christian fiction.
My goodness.
Where everything ends up.
Yeah.
Sweet.
Oh boy. Yeah.
Oh, what have I done? But you see what I'm saying? In other words, the book tells you, and as you were writing characters, like sometimes a character would tell me, I have to do this. I go, you can't do that. That's stupid, you can't do that. And it would be like, if I don't, I'm not me.
Yeah, part of the process of artistry is to listen to your work.
Yes.
Let it drive
Yes.
you rather
And you
than
better obey it.
Obey it. Yes.
Because if you don't, it'll feel contrived.
Right.
It'll feel like you were in control. You weren't in the you took too much power over the conversation, right?
Does that relate to the shadow? Does that relate to discovery of yourself rolled back to you?
I'll tell you what it did do, though, was enter me into a conversation between open theology and Reformed theology.
Yes. Yeah.
As the story is getting written, what does he know?
That's right. Yeah.
What does it mean to have free agency? So I'm not saying I came to an answer, but I'm a 4. I have a lot of high openness to experience. I'm okay with not having the answer. But it's like, it did throw that question up, right? It's like, well, if this is a story, we think narratively, and of course, narrative is such a huge part of everything, it's like, does God know what I'm doing next? Or is it, as the story is getting written, he's not surprised? is God in the moment just responding with urgent immediacy and presence to whatever happens? He's not surprised, but he's like, oh, it's like, well, I didn't, okay. If you want to do that, but do you see where I'm going? In other words, does God, I don't know. And I don't know the answer to it. I guess you can make a case on either side.
You can.
And
it might be both.
it's just very disturbing in a wonderful way.
When you find yourself going into suffering, what are some practices, strategies to help you dive down and find the monster whale, rather than just fight back to the surface?
The etymology of the word to suffer in Latin it literally means to allow. I think one of the things we have to do is allow suffering to have its way with us until it's finished its business. Whether that's grief or whatever experience you may, depression. We not saying not to take steps, but you can't. I think the more the principle of the more you resist, the more it persists. So to allow it and to be in a community that helps you to continue to allow it. There's nothing worse, I think, than the belief that you suffer alone. Like, how when people say, oh, I don't know how you feel? I think that's the worst news ever. Do you know what I mean? Like, I think that's part of a sort of a weird 60s sort of like mindset. I don't know where that came from. I think it's like being empathic, but it's a terrible message. It's like, I want someone to tell me, within 5 miles of here, there are 10 people who know exactly how you dang feel. There are 10 people within probably a block of here who know the kind of suffering you're in right now. So this interdependence, we are in this together, right?
Yeah.
Like
community.
Lots of us are in that suffering now, or have survived that suffering, or been made more beautiful by that suffering. So that would be one. It's the practice of community. It's the very hard work. Again, I use the word of giving God consent. Consent is a hard word. I often say that, I really do believe Christianity is not something you do, it's something that gets done to you. Your only job is to consent, but that's a heck of a job. It is hard to consent. The last thing that ego wants to do is consent. To say, I give up, and I'm going to allow someone greater than myself to do for me what I cannot do for myself. That's very hard. It takes a wise counselor, spiritual director to make that, help create the container in which that can occur for somebody, right? While encouraging them not to get stuck in some point in the river. That's been my experience, and it can take a long time. Some things can take a long time, and some things never go away. And I think we have anticipations that they will. They don't. You learn how to put them in a place where they aren't interruptive or destructive in your life. I'll always be an addict, always. Pardon me, I've done such a study on Tibetan Buddhism for 5 years, so I'm going to just draw another thing that I think is continuous with the gospel. I am a Christian, okay, and I'm not a Buddhist Christian. I will say I'm a Buddhist enriched Christian, all right? So, but the word for suffering they use is dukkha, D-U-K-K-A. And literally, the definition of Ethan Nichtern, who I love, says it's the feeling of not at home. Mm-hmm. Right? Now, we all live with the feeling of not at home all the time, spiritually, right? We all are longing and waiting, Romans, right? In anticipation of the return, of the consummation of everything. So we all have it, but in moments of suffering, it's a heightened experience of not at home. If you've been sexually abused, the sense of not at home, it's like screaming not at home. It's a terrible announcement. Not at home. Depression. Not at home. A panic episode. Not at home. Right? And also, by the way, I'll just say this last. Sometimes when you suffer, it's your soul summoning you. It's telling you something's going on that you're not paying attention to. Like you have not paid attention. Like, for example, you have chosen a call in life that's not yours. It was your dad's. You're living someone else's story. Or it's an acquired story. It's not your story.
Yeah.
and then you have a depression at 35 or anxiety, and you can't figure out why, if you go to a good therapist, they're going to say, well, maybe your soul, the symptom is actually your soul telling you something that you need to pay attention to get your life right and properly aligned with yourself. So, dukkha, not at home. I love that. Oh, what a great concept, you know.
This conversation it's an ongoing dialogue and trialogue and communal reality. I think we have to accept. But thank you so much for beginning this journey for us as the journey into culture care, journey into Fuller Seminary's future. Thank you.
Thank you.